My name is Chris Dias. I am a program manager on the VS Code team, and I don't have any slides. Instead, what we're going to do is use VS Code to make our slides in Markdown. So I actually have an extension in Markdown. It's called Reveal.js, and lets me take Markdown slides, or Markdown, and turn them into slides. And so the next 30 minutes, what I want to do is talk about VS Code and how to optimize sort of we call it the inner loop of node development, stuff that you do every hour, every day. For you doing your node development. So like I said, I'm a program manager on the VS Code team. And one other thing here. We have to set the proper theme, because you can do this with the Reveal.js. White, league, sky. Which one do we like? Moon is nice. I like moon. We'll go with that. So that's what our agenda is today. We're going to talk a little bit about code editing and TypeScript and type checking and some refactoring stuff. I'm going to try to show you what you can do with tasks. Tasks are this thing that let you loosely integrate other tools in your tool chain together with VS Code. Lots of sort of tips on debugging and how you can debug different combinations or variations of Node apps and Docker apps. We'll do some containerization in VS Code with a Docker extension. We'll push that up to Docker Hub. And then we'll do some deployment up to the cloud. We'll use Azure and extensions in that space. So that is our agenda. And we only have 20 minutes, so let's get going. All right, we'll close this. Yeah, we'll come back to you later. Let's see. First thing I want to do is I want to talk about editing of your source code in VS Code. And this is kind of almost the hardest. Actually, let me ask one question. Can everybody see? Should I make it bigger? Is it good enough? Bigger? I heard a bigger. OK. We'll make it one more bigger. Good? Better? How's that? Gigantic. Whew. All right, I got to do one less. OK, so this is the hardest thing to demo because it just works, and you shouldn't have to ever think about it at all. And so this is just some plain JavaScript code. It is a Node Express application, and a couple things just to notice in here. If I come in here, where is it? Dir name, right? Comes from Node, and I hover over it, and I see var underscore dir name is a type string. And where does that information come from? Well, it actually comes from Typescript definition files. And what we do in VS Code is we actually use Typescript, the language server, the compiler, to drive our JavaScript experience inside VS Code. And so what's happening is when I come in here and I have a require of a particular package, in the background, what will happen, we'll just come in here, if I type in app, and I get IntelliSense against app, which is an Express object, what happens in the background is we actually go up to NPM. If you were here for the last talk, we go to NPM, and we pull down a TypeScript definition file. I'll show you a little bit what that looks like. I'm going to go over here to a gulp file. And if I go over here to gulp and I right-click on it and I say go to definition, we're going to open up this index.d.ts file, which is a TypeScript definition file. If you hover over it, it's hard to see because of the size, but it shows me it's in the library cache for TypeScript. And I open it up in the Finder, and we look here, you can see, whoops, it's in this folder, right? Gulp, types, node modules. What happens is we go and we download that, and I can show you if I come in here and where is it? Gulp. Did I miss it? Glob. What did I do? It's here somewhere. All right, gulp, up one folder. Come on, you. It's in here. Oh, there it is. I'm going to go and delete this folder. That's what I wanted to do. I just wanted to delete it. And so what happens now, if I come in here, that file's gone. If I come back over here to my gulp file, and I type in gulp dot, you can see that we actually get the completion list back already, because already in the background we've gone and we've downloaded that TypeScript definition file again. So if I go back over here to gulp and I say go to definition, you can see the file is already back on the machine. We've already downloaded it in the background back to that location. So that's what happens in the background. As you're typing code and you're requiring new modules, we go and we pull down those TypeScript definitions for you, so that you end up with basically a rich IntelliSense experience against all of your Node packages without you having to do anything. So that's pretty cool, and that's one cool way that we used TypeScript for the language service. The other thing that we can do with TypeScript is come in here, and since this is just plain JavaScript, and TypeScript is pretty smart, we can say, hey, you know what, can you start to look at my JavaScript and tell me interesting things about it? So I can, at the top of the file, say, you know, @tscheck. And what this will do is turn on type checking by the TypeScript compiler on my plain Node JavaScript code. So if I come in here and I change app to app blah, 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 I'm going to get an error under that, and it says it can't find that. That's because the TypeScript compiler is giving me that information. It's even smart if I come in here and I say, let message equals hello, and I say message equals 10, I'm going to get an error on that as well, right? Because it says it's not assignable to a type of string. And if I'm super smart, if I'm smarter than a TypeScript compiler and I know what I'm doing, I can say ignore this error message, and it'll add a directive to the file and say, ignore the next line. Don't do any type checking on it for me. So this is pretty cool because what I can do is take my JavaScript code and start to tighten it up by using the smarts of the TypeScript compiler. And in this case, we did it on a file-by-file basis, right? I added this tscheck flag to the top of the file. But another thing that I can do is actually add this and basically to an entire folder, a workspace. So if I come in here to the server folder and I say create a new file and we call it jsconfig.json, this is effectively like tsconfig. It's almost like a project file. It defines the scope of what the compiler should look like. And so I can come in here and quickly scaffold this out. If I press Control Space, I get IntelliSense on the schema for this file because we understand that it is a jsconfig JSON file. I'll set up some compiler options, and we'll say check.js. And by default, it's off, but we can change that to true. And what this will do then is for this server folder, it'll start to turn on the TypeScript compiler for me. So all I have to do is go and open up the file again. And if we come back down here, we can see that the compiler has kicked in for me. So what I can do is do it on a per file basis, or I can scope it out and do it on a folder basis or an entire workspace basis. All right, so we'll get rid of that. A couple other cool things that we can do here. Let me just delete that so we don't get any noise. A couple of cool things that we get from TypeScript in this case. Sorry, because of the zoom, the scrolling is a little bit jumpy. Another thing I can do is sort of highlight a whole set of block of code. We get another tooltip or light bulb that comes up. It says extract function in a global scope. And I click on that. It'll actually extract it out. It'll put me into rename mode, so I can say, set roots. And it'll create that function, and if I hold down the Option key and navigate to it, I can see we've actually refactored. And that's all coming from the TypeScript compiler. So it drives it, it powers it from the JavaScript experience from the back end. So that's kind of some sort of cool things or understandings, things that you can do with JavaScript, just plain JavaScript as you're writing your code, and start to take advantage of TypeScript and VS Code to help you out. OK, so the next thing I want to do is talk about something called tasks. And we saw earlier that I've got this gulp file. And of course, it's got a ton of different tasks in it. And if I wanted to run something in here, I could bring up the integrated terminal, and I could say, gulp populate MongoDB, which is oh, I don't have gulp installed on the machine. npm install gulp. That's OK. But you can come here to the terminal and you can run gulp and run all of your tasks. But what's actually cooler is that VS Code, if you bring up the command palette, which is Command P, and you type in the word task and press space, what will happen is it'll go and interrogate your package.json for any npm scripts. It'll go look in your gulp file or grunt file and basically factor out all of those tasks that are there. And then you can just quickly run them, right? So I can just say, I want to run that task. And the next question it actually asks you is, do you want to scan the output as a result of that task? What that means is that if I've got a gulp task that does like a TypeScript compile or a less compile, I can create something called a problem matcher, which is really just a really good regular expression. And the output of that task will be parsed by that regular expression and will hoist any problems or errors that we detect into the problems pane. So I'm not going to do that for this one, but that's one of the things that you can set up. And so then all that will do is it'll go off and it'll run that populate MongoDB task for me. So that's pretty cool. I can kind of go Control-P and run the tasks. But it's a couple of extra steps. I can actually make this a little bit cooler. So if I come in here and press task again, and if I hover over this list over on the right-hand side, you can see there's a gear. And if I click on that gear, it's going to bring up a new file. It's called tasks.json. And tasks.json is the file that you can use to configure how your tasks externally run and then how it's brought into the tool. And you can see here there's the option to have a problem matcher, which we won't do. But one of the things that I can do instead is come over here, and we'll press Control Space again because we understand the schema. I can say it's part of a group, and it is the build group. Why are we getting a squiggle? Expected comma or closing brace. Right there. Thank you for telling me. Well, what I can do is I can say, you know what, this is actually the build task. Right? I'm defining this as my build task. And once I do that, I get automatically get my key binding set up for Command-Shift-B. When I press Command-Shift-B, we run that task for you. And so then you can go in and you can start to create key bindings against certain tasks, however you want to run them, so you can quickly get those set up. So that's how we can sort of loosely integrate tools that are around your development experience into VS Code without making you sort of configure your tools in a different way for using the tool. You run them the way that you always run them, and we loosely integrate them into the tool. OK, so now that we've got some tasks set up, what I want to do is sort of debug and run this application. Or we'll run and debug it. So I haven't done anything. All I have to do right now, I haven't done anything to configure debugging. All I have to do right now is just press F5 on index.js. It's going to say, all right, what kind of app is this? And we know it's a Node app. And that's all I have to do. Now I'm debugging. You can see the server's running on port 3000 because it ran index.js. And if we go over to the browser and we say localhost, nothing bad came up there. Localhost 3000, and I already had a breakpoint set in there in my route. I'm now broken into my Node application, right? I didn't have to do anything, and there's no configuration. I can come here and I can see all the local variables. I can set up watches. I can see the full call stack. I've got a full debug REPL down here, so I can say, what do we want to see? Render data, right? I get IntelliSense in there as well, and it'll evaluate the object. And in fact, I can drill down there and start to explore and understand what's going on in my app. So that's kind of cool, right? It's pretty simple to get up and running with debugging. It's not that I have to, I don't know why that's there. It's not that I just have to run my application. Let's say I want to run and debug my gulp file that we saw earlier. I can do that too, right? So if I go into my gulp file, and we go back up to the top to this populate MongoDB function, I put a breakpoint there. If I open up the breakpoint, or the debug viewlet, it's a little bit squished again because of the size. There's a little gear up here, and you see there's a red dot because there is no launch.json, which is the thing that we were using to configure debugging. You see the pattern. There's a task.json for setting up tasks. There's a launch.json for setting up debugging. And so what I can do is say, you know what? I want to configure how this works a little bit more. So this will go through, and it'll figure out from package.json what to launch. But then I can come in here and set things like oops, why did you do that? Comma. Space, like environment variables. So if I want to come in here and set a set of environment variables, I can get all those things set up. But what we want to do is click on this big blue button where it says Add Configuration. And we're going to say we want to debug a gulp task. And what this will do is basically say, hey, it's a Node app, and we're going to run gulp. And so it knows gulp is in my Node modules folder. And the task that I'm going to run is one that we defined earlier over here in our task.json. But what I need to do is give it a name, a fully unique name. So I can say the identifier is gulp build. Oops, wait a minute. Sorry. I'm combining two debugging topics. I got ahead of myself. So for this one, what you're doing the gulp task, this is what's supposed to say populate MongoDB. And so then when we go to our debug viewlet and we change to the gulp task and we hit run, what will happen is it'll actually break into my gulp file, right? Yes, gulp, populate Mongo. Oh, I spelt it wrong. That's the problem. Sorry about that. MongoDB. And now when we press F5, we'll actually break into our gulp file, and then we can start to debug that process. So if I have mocha tests, anything that's basically node-based, I can debug and run those from the debugger as well, as much in the same way that I debug my application. All right, so we'll stop that. A couple more cool things that we can do in launch.json. I've got another extension installed here, is the Chrome debugger. And the Chrome debugger lets me debug the client-side code. And so I can add another configuration for the Chrome debugger, and we know that our app is listening on port 3000. And when I launch this debug configuration, launch Chrome, you see something that's going to happen. I'm going to get a new debug instance of Chrome coming up, but the server's not running, right? So I can come over here to a terminal, We'll close that. And I can just say npm start, because I know that there's a task in there for port 3000. And if we restart the app, restart the debugger, and come back over here, our app is now up and loaded. I can come back into my client-side code, which, let's see, we'll go to roots, browse. Okay, there's already a breakpoint there. And when I refresh the page, boom, now we're stopped in our client-side code. So not only can I set up my debugging for my server-side code, but also my client-side code. And of course, I can step into that. But it was kind of a pain to have to go over here and start up the node process. So another thing that I can do in the debug launch.json is say compounds. And what I can do now is I can say, I actually want to run 2 debug sessions. And what we're going to do is we're going to do launch program, which was the first one that we created. And we'll do launch Chrome. And so we're going to say, run these 2. And again, I pick the appropriate configuration. I press play. And you'll see that the browser is started up and the server is started up. And when we hit refresh here, we're going to break in the client side. And we don't have our breakpoint set in the server anymore. We can go back over here. We'll set our breakpoint in the server. And again, refresh the page. Now I'm stepping or stopping in the client-side code. And when I press play here, we'll break over in the server-side code. And there's a little picker. And this picker will let you choose basically which debugger to look at. So I can say launch program. My call stack and everything over in the debug viewlet will change accordingly. So that's kind of how you can set up basically client-side debugging, server-side debugging, debugging of any type of node thing, and then combine them together to an end-to-end debug experience. OK, the last thing that I want to talk about quickly from debugging, which was, I sort of alluded to it before because I got ahead of myself. One of the things that I actually want to do is before I actually launch a debug session, I want to run that gulp build. So if I make client-side changes and I just press F5 and I run the server, the client side hasn't been started yet. I have to go in and run gulp or do a command combination. But what I can also do in my launch.json is down here in this first one, launch program that we created. I can come in here and I can say the pre-launch task is gulp build. All right? And so what this is doing is saying before you run this start up the debugger for this session, go and find this task called gulp build, run that. When that is done, then start the server. So if I come back over here and we pick our last configuration, which is our launch program, which is this one, and I press F5, you'll see what happens is that gulp build, I did populate Mongo. But basically what happens is it said, please go run that gulp task before you launch the debugger. All right, so you can have a build process that runs every time you hit F5. So very, very flexible ways to go and configure your debug sessions inside VS Code. All right, so with all of those things set up, and my app is up and running, and I love it, the next thing that I want to do is actually go and containerize it so I can get it up into the cloud. And so I've got an extension in here. It's called the Docker extension. Pretty awesome name. Makes sense what it is. But what it does is it adds a whole set of commands to the command palette. And in Explorer, it lets you sort of do the inner loop of doing container development. All right? And so what I can do is come back over here to my application. And before we get into the Explorer, what I'm going to do is say, you know what? I want to Dockerize this application. So I can bring up the command palette, which is Command P. And I type in greater than sign, which gives me access to all of the commands in the tool. And I can say Docker. Add Docker files to workspace. And it's kind of like what we saw with the debug configuration. We say, hey, what kind of app is it? It's a Node.js app. What port does it listen on? We just default to 3000. And what that'll do is it'll go into my workspace, and it will go and create a Docker file for me, a Docker Compose file, a Docker Compose debug file, which I'll talk about in a second, and of course a Docker ignore file. So once I've got those created, I can basically come over here to the Docker file, right-click, and say Build Image. And what that'll do is say, hey, what do I want to name it? And I'll call it Sticker App Latest. And luckily, we've already got some of the bits on the machine already, so it should be very quick. And what it's going to do is going to go run npm install inside the container. It's going to move the node modules folder that it's creating back over so that you get a very fast iterative process when you're rebuilding the container. And that's it. That's all we had to do. And now what I can do is I can say, Docker compose. I'll just say compose up. And it's going to look for any compose files in the workspace. And you say, well, we'll run this one. And it'll go launch that server for me. And if we go back to the browser and we come back to localhost 3000, in this case, we're actually running the server out of the container. And the reason you don't see any data is because when we were running it before, we're running against the local Mongo database. And so I have to tell it where that database is to get any data out of it. All right, so that's basically how you can sort of get quickly up and running with Docker. If we come over here to the viewlet, and we can see in here we've got a set of images, and I've also got my running container. I can right-click on it. I can say show logs, which isn't very exciting because we saw it earlier, but basically you can see console.log output from the query that we ran is being output there. And of course, I can say stop this container, and it'll stop it. It'll only take a second, and then it'll go away. But let's say that I actually want to go and debug this container. I'm betting that there's an easy way to set up launch configuration to do that, and there is. So we sort of stopped the application. Let's go look at the debug compose file that was generated for us, and a few things to note in here. Oops, there's our sticker app. Say we'll want the latest. And what we do initially when we create this file using the extension is we map in the file system underneath to the container. So if you want to run nodemon in the container and you want to make edits against the local file system, with the tool you can make those edits. Nodemon will restart inside the container, and you can sort of run it and debug it that way. But we don't need to do that here. So we'll just get rid of that. And so the Docker compose file is going to start up the image. It's going to expose the app port, and it's also going to expose the debug port. So if I say Docker compose up, and I choose the debug version, that'll spin up the image. And you can see the debugger is listening on 9229. So we'll go back over to our launch configuration. And there's another configuration that we can add in here, which is to attach to a remote program. And we use this to, where'd you go? Where'd you go? Attached to remote. So this is the one that we use for attaching to a Docker container. So we'll say Docker, and the TCP IP address, of course, is going to be localhost. Oops, localhost 9229. And the last thing that we have to do is we have to tell it where in the container is the code. And of course, in our Docker file, you can see over here that we're putting all the code into user source app. So we'll just take that. We'll go back over here to our launch.json. Tell VS Code where that code is inside the container so that it can map in the debugger. We'll go back over to our server node, make sure that we've got our breakpoint set. Yep, we've got our breakpoint set. And now what I can do is come back over. We'll say Docker. We'll click on play. And what will happen is it will now attach to the debugger, all right? Or attach the debugger to the running container. See, we have a new button up here. Instead of stop, it's detached. So then when I refresh the page for localhost, we actually break back into VS Code. But what we're doing here is we're debugging the code that's running inside the container. And all we had to do is configure launch.json to set that up. So that's pretty cool. All right, so we'll stop that. The last thing I want to do with the container is I want to go and publish it up to Docker Hub so that we can run it in the cloud. So I'm going to right-click on this. I'm going to say tag the image. And of course, we'll say Chris Dias, which is my Docker Hub account. We'll change that tag, and then what I can do is right-click and say push. And because it's Chris Dias / whatever, it knows by default to push it up to Docker Hub, and this should only take a second because there's some of the images are up there already. And once it's up there, then we can deploy this thing. And so we need some place to deploy it to, which is, in this case, we'll use Azure. So we've got a new extension that we've just recently installed. It's in its infancy. It's for Azure App Service. And I have one subscription here. It's called the MSDN subscription, which is my personal subscription. I can come in here and I can say, Azure select subscriptions. I'm already logged in. You can't see it down here in the status bar because we've made everything so large. But what happens is, when I log in, I've got a set of subscriptions that I have access to in Azure. In this case, it's MSDN, and then there's a to-do app subscription. But I only want to see the MSDN subscription, and so it filters it down here. And what I can do is I can just press this button and say, yes, I would like to go create a new app service. I choose the subscription where I want it to be placed in. I've already created a resource group It's funny, we have the Bill G demo resource group because we met with Bill the other day, which was kind of fun. But we have this Node interactive resource group, and in Azure, a resource group is basically a metadata container. It says, my application is made up of these 15 different pieces. They're all in this thing called the resource group. So then I could manage the application by managing the resource group. So we'll put in the Node interactive resource group. The plan that we'll use is basically the machine that we want the website to live on up in Azure. And I've already created this machine. It's a pretty beefy machine for a demo. But basically, by default, we create a Linux box up in Azure. There's actually no option to create a Windows box in Azure for this just yet. So I can come in here, and now I have to say, what's my application going to be, which is globally unique. So we'll say cdias sticker app 88776. And what that will do, last thing I have to do is I tell it which version of Node I want it to run. Because what will happen is the application will be deployed up to the website on this Linux box in Azure, and Azure uses a container for the runtime. So I'm basically telling it what version of Node, what container instance or image do I want to use to run this application, and in this case, I want to use, I think I said Node 6.9. So that's created the application. If I command or option click on it, we'll go and browse the site, and this is the default application web app that gets created up in Azure. It doesn't have our content in it yet, right? This is the default thing. Now we have to get our application up there. And to do that, there's a couple of different ways that I can do it. The first way that I can do it, which is really just for fun at this point, is that I can come in here and I can right-click on the application and I can say deploy a zip package to the web app. And what this would do is zip up the folder except for the Node modules folder, copy it up to Azure, expand it, and then run npm install on the machine. Now that's going to take a couple of seconds to do. So instead of doing that, what I want to do is go and deploy the Docker image that we pushed up to Docker Hub a few minutes ago. And to do that, what I'm going to do is use the Azure CLI. Now, once the website was created, one of the files that we actually generated, I don't know if you saw this flash up when the site was done, is this bash script, right? And the bash script is basically the history of what we created. Sorry, it's the scrolling. The history of what we created, right? You can see all the questions that were asked. Where's the subscription, the resource group, location, all that stuff. And then it's basically all the steps to run the Azure CLI to create this thing up in Azure, which is cool because it's not this black box extension. It created something, I don't know what the heck it did, and I'm kind of stuck. We give you basically the tools to go and recreate it. And what's nice about it, it's a bash script. It can run on Windows, it can run on Mac or Linux because we have bash support on Windows now. But I've got another extension installed. It's called the Azure CLI Extension. And if I change the MIME type of this document to be this scrapbook, what happens is I end up getting this really rich IntelliSense experience against the Azure CLI. So I type in AZ, I press space, and then I get IntelliSense against the CLI. So I can come in here and I can say web app, configure, let's see, container, and I'm going to say set the container to be Docker custom image name. Let's see, actually, yes, Docker custom image name, and it'll be Chris Dias sticker app latest. That's the image that we pushed up to Docker Hub. Now we need the name of the site, and so then what happens here is you can see I've got an IntelliSense little pop-up that came up. If you can see it, it basically knows which websites I've got created up in Azure and gives that back to me as an IntelliSense list, and so I can just pick that. And then to run it, all I have to do is press Command tick, and it'll execute that command in an active terminal. So you can see that command that we quickly typed up, AZ web app config, is now being run up in Azure, and now we've set up the custom image up there. So if we go back here to our, actually I can just launch it from the Explorer. I can right-click on the app and I can say browse the website. And so this is our app. It's going to take a second for it to come up because what's happening up in Azure, there we go. What was happening up in Azure was basically doing a Docker pull on that machine and bringing that down and then spinning it up. So we had to refresh it a couple times and boom, there's our application that's up and running. But again, we don't have any data up here. And the reason again for that is because it was initially looking for a local MongoDB database. But what we can do is we can say, hey, you know what? Instead of using a local MongoDB database, we can use a MongoDB database that is up in the cloud. So we have another extension for Azure. It's called Cosmos DB. And in that, I can come in here and I can say I want to create a database. We'll call it the stickers DB. And the collection is stickers. And I need to put some data in there, right? You'll see it'll get created up there. And if I click on it, we actually come back with a document, a query basically of what's going on up in that database, and it's empty. So I want to get some data up there. And this is, basically if I'm doing my inner loop where I want to sort of quickly move data around, I can do this. I've got a local Mongo database, which is what we were querying before. I can just copy all of the documents out of that database, come back over here to my collection up in the cloud. You can see I'm connected down here to the one in the cloud. And I can create this new file. It's called the scrapbook1 Mongo. And basically what this file type does, like we had with the Azure CLI, is it gives you a rich IntelliSense experience against a resource. So I can come in here and say db.stickers, find, and if I execute that, let's see if I execute that. We can see we don't have any data that comes back. So all we have to do in this case, which is, again, like your inner loop, I can say, insert many, open parens, I'll paste in all that data from the local database, and we'll run that command again. It'll insert them into the database in the cloud. So if I say db.stickers.find again and run it, you can see now all that data has been moved up into Azure. And so in order to tell the application where that data is, I can right-click over in my database, copy the connection string. I can go over to my app service, and we're going to open it up. We give you a deep link into the portal where that app is. And all I have to do is set basically an environment variable, because I know the app looks for an environment variable called MongoDB. And that's something that you do through application settings. And so if I come in here and I say MongoDB URL, and I paste in my connection string, and I save it, what will happen is, again, we'll restart the container up in the cloud. And if I come back to my website and I refresh it here a couple of times, come on, go fast. Boom. We've moved all of our data up in the cloud, and we've deployed it. So that's what we had to do to sort of take our application that was local and deploy it up into the cloud. And I am 1 minute and 35 seconds over. That's all I had to show today. So last but not least on my slides that we had, let's see, right-click, reveal, active, open presentation in browser. There's our presentation from earlier. Boom, boom, boom. Thank you. Follow us at Code. We got the coolest Twitter handle ever. Go to our website, and of course, we're open source on GitHub. If you have issues, submit them up there. That's where we do all of our development in the open. Thank you.